The dust had not even settled behind her boots before every man in Caldwell, Kansas turned to look, and what they saw was not what any of them expected on that blazing afternoon in the summer of 1882. She came down the main street of Caldwell alone, moving with the particular kind of dignity that only comes from having already survived something most people never would. She wore a calico dress that had once been blue but had faded to the color of a winter sky, and she carried an infant against her chest with one arm, wrapped tight in a piece of cloth that had been knotted over her shoulder. Her other hand held a single carpetbag, and that carpetbag was so light it swung at her side like it was barely holding anything at all. The bruise on her left cheekbone was deep purple, the kind of bruise that spoke volumes before a single word had been uttered, and her jaw was set with a determination that made it clear she was not looking for sympathy. She was looking for somewhere to stop. Her name was Henrietta Norris, and she was 24 years old, and she had walked 3 miles in the Kansas heat to reach this town because the last place she had been was no longer safe. Caldwell in the summer of 1882 was a border town sitting right on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a cattle town that had seen enough rough men and rough nights to fill a dozen dime novels. It had a reputation that made respectable people nervous and made dangerous people comfortable, and the main street reflected that reality with perfect honesty. There was a saloon on one side and a dry goods store on the other, a small post office with a crooked sign, a barber, a blacksmith's operation that filled the air with the smell of hot iron, and at the far end, set slightly apart from everything else, a building with a painted sign that read Sutton's boarding house and meals. Henrietta had not planned on ending up in Caldwell. She had not planned on most things that had happened in the last year of her life, but she was here now, and the baby against her chest was beginning to fuss in the heat, and so she walked toward the only building in town that looked like it might have a bed and a door that locked. She was maybe 20 yards from the boarding house when she heard the hoofbeats behind her. She did not run. Running would have been an admission of fear, and fear had a smell to it that certain kinds of men could track like bloodhounds. She kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her chin up, even as the horse slowed to a walk behind her, and the voice she had been hoping never to hear again came rolling down the street like a stone down a hillside. Henrietta. Her name in that man's mouth sounded like a warning. She pushed through the front door of Sutton's boarding house without knocking. The inside of the boarding house was clean and plain, with a front room that held a long wooden table and several chairs, a small counter near the back wall where a register sat, and the smell of something being cooked drifting through from a back room. There was a window with muslin curtains and a braided rug on the plank floor and a rack near the door where several hats hung on their pegs. It was an honest room, a room that had been cared for without pretension, and Henrietta took it all in within the span of 2 heartbeats before she spun around. The man in the doorway was not her pursuer. He had stepped into the frame from somewhere to the left, so quickly and so solidly that it was almost as though the door itself had grown a man. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was rough with 3 days of growth. He wore a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, suspenders and boots that had seen genuine use. His eyes were the color of creek water in the shade, a gray-green that moved between calm and alert in the same instant, and they had fixed themselves on the street outside with an expression that was not aggression but was absolutely unmistakably resolve. He stood in the doorway and he did not move. Outside, the horse had stopped. The man on it said nothing for a moment, and the silence had the particular texture of a man calculating odds. "That woman came in there," the voice said. "Lots of people come in here," the man in the doorway said. His voice was even unhurried, the kind of voice that had decided what it was going to say before it opened its mouth. "It's a boarding house. She belongs to me. Not in my establishment, she doesn't." Another silence. Henrietta stood behind him, pressing herself against the interior wall, one hand over the baby's head instinctively, though the baby had gone very still. She could see the back of the man in the doorway, could see the set of his shoulders, could see how absolutely still he was standing. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the voice outside said. "I know what I'm looking at," the man in the doorway said. "And what I'm looking at is a man on a horse on a public street. That's where you'll stay." There was a long moment. Then the sound of hoofbeats again, slow at first, then fading down the street and around a corner. The man in the doorway did not move until the sound was fully gone, and then he turned around. He looked at Henrietta for a moment without speaking, taking in the baby, the carpet bag, the bruise, the whole exhausted and defiant picture of her, and his expression shifted into something careful and decent. "You hungry?" he said. Henrietta blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that had not been one of them. "I have money," she said, because it seemed important to establish that immediately. "Didn't ask that," he said. He stepped away from the door and moved toward the counter. "Name's Peter Sutton. I run this place. You want a room and a meal, you're welcome to both." "Henrietta Norris," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "The baby is Clara. She's 4 months old." Peter Sutton looked at the infant, who had recovered from her stillness and was beginning to make small sounds of hunger and dissatisfaction. He nodded once, as though the existence of a 4-month-old was a perfectly reasonable thing to encounter on a Tuesday afternoon. "Room's $1.50 a week," he said. "Meals included. There's a woman named Dolers who cooks dinner and helps with laundry on Mondays. You'll have the room at the end of the hall. It's got a good lock." That last detail, offered so matter-of-factly, nearly undid Henrietta entirely. She pressed her lips together and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton." "Peter's fine," he said. He handed her a key from a hook on the wall behind the counter. "Dining room serves at 6. You need anything before then, kitchen's through that door and you're welcome to it." He did not ask about the bruise. He did not ask about the man on the horse. He did not ask where she had come from, or what had happened, or how long she intended to stay. He handed her the key and left her to settle in, and Henrietta stood in the middle of the front room for a moment with the key in her palm, feeling something she had almost forgotten the texture of: safety. The room at the end of the hall was small but real, with a rope bed and a straw mattress that was freshly covered in clean cotton ticking, a washstand with a white pitcher and basin, a braided rug in shades of red and brown, and a window that looked out onto the back lot where a vegetable garden grew in tidy rows. There was a small dresser with a mirror, and a wooden chair, and a hook behind the door for hanging clothes. The lock was a good iron bolt that slid home with a satisfying click. Henrietta sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself breathe. Clara fussed, and she unwrapped the cloth sling and held the baby up to look at her, this small, serious-faced creature who had somehow survived everything alongside her. Clara had her father's dark hair and Henrietta's brown eyes, and she was 4 months of perfect, bewildering life, and looking at her was the only thing that consistently made Henrietta feel like the world still had a floor beneath it. "We are all right," Henrietta told the baby softly. "We are going to be all right now." Clara made a sound that may or may not have been agreement, and then communicated her primary concern quite clearly. And Henrietta fed her daughter and watched the light change on the back garden and thought, very carefully, about what came next. What had come before was a man named Calhoun Briggs, who had married Henrietta when she was 22, and he was 38, in a town 2 counties over, and who had seemed to her young self like a man of substance and authority and steady prospects. He had been all of those things, technically speaking. He had also been a man whose temper lived very close to the surface, and whose idea of authority extended in directions that Henrietta had not fully understood until she was already inside it. She had tried to make the best of it, the way women in her circumstances were expected to. And then Clara had been born, and something in Henrietta had shifted permanently. There were things she would endure and things she would not, and a bruise on her own face was one category of thing, and the idea of her daughter growing up watching it was a different category entirely. The kind of category that made a woman pack a bag at 3 in the morning and walk out into the dark. She had been walking, in one way or another, for 6 weeks. Caldwell had not been a destination. It had simply been where she ran out of road. She did not know yet what it was going to become. Dinner at 6 o'clock was a revelation of a different kind than the room with the good lock. The dining room was the long table in the front room, set with plain crockery and tin cups, and a candle in the middle that lent everything a warm amber quality in the fading light. There were 4 other boarders. A cattle buyer from Wichita who talked too much, a young cowboy named Abilene Jack who was working at the stockyards and had the particular combination of swagger and homesickness that characterized men barely 20 years old, a quiet older woman named Mrs. Hatch who was waiting for her son to send for her, and a surveyor named Dawkins who was mapping land for the railroad and who ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed meals as a logistical problem to be solved. Peter Sutton sat at the head of the table and spoke little, but made everyone feel attended to, which Henrietta recognized as a genuine skill. He refilled cups without being asked, and passed the bread without making a production of it, and listened to the cattle buyer's stories about Wichita with an expression of patient, mild interest that contained not a single ounce of actual curiosity. The food was good. There was roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and green beans cooked with fatback and cornbread, and Henrietta, who had been eating very sparingly for 6 weeks, had to make a conscious effort not to eat too quickly. Clara slept in the sling against her chest through the whole meal, a warm, small weight that Henrietta was constantly aware of without being distracted by, the way you are aware of your own heartbeat. After dinner, when the cattle buyer had retired to the saloon and the surveyor had gone to study his maps, and Mrs. Hatch had gone to write her letters and Abilene Jack had lingered over a second piece of cornbread before following the cattle buyer's general direction, Henrietta found herself sitting at the table across from Peter Sutton while he drank a cup of coffee, and she drank a cup of weak tea she had found in the kitchen. "The man on the horse," Peter said, not looking up from his cup. "Will he come back?" "Probably," Henrietta said honestly. There was no point in softening it. "Is he your husband?" "He was." She paused. "I left. I do not intend to go back." Peter nodded slowly, turning his cup in his hands. "Does he know anyone in Caldwell?" "I don't believe so, but he has a way of finding things out." "What's his name?" "Calhoun Briggs." She watched Peter's face for recognition and did not see any. "He runs cattle operation out of Comanche County. He has money and he has friends with money and he uses both fairly freely." Peter was quiet for a moment. "You have family somewhere you could go to, somewhere safer than a border town." "My parents are gone. I have a cousin in Missouri, but she has her own burdens." Henrietta looked at him steadily. "I am not telling you this to ask for more than I've already been given, Mr. Sutton. I paid for a room and I'm grateful for it. I'm just answering your question honestly." He met her eyes then fully, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was something in his expression that was not pity, which she appreciated greatly, and not curiosity in the intrusive sense, but rather a kind of careful attention that felt like being genuinely seen. "Peter," he reminded her. "Peter," she repeated. "You're welcome here as long as you need to be," he said. "And if Calhoun Briggs comes back, he'll find the same doorway he found this afternoon." Henrietta felt something shift in her chest, something she did not entirely have words for yet. She folded her hands around her teacup and looked at this man she had known for perhaps 6 hours, and thought about the fact that he had stood in that doorway without knowing a single thing about her except that she had needed him to. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "This afternoon. You didn't know me." Peter considered the question. "I saw a woman with a baby and a bruise on her face, and I saw a man on a horse coming behind her." He shrugged as if the rest of it were self-evident. "Didn't need to know much beyond that." It was the simplest possible answer, and it was also, she thought, a complete one. She went to bed that night with Clara tucked into the center of the mattress surrounded by rolled blankets, and she lay beside her daughter and listened to the sounds of Caldwell at night, the distant noise from the saloon, the horses shifting in the livery, the wind across the open plains that came through even in summer, and she thought about Peter Sutton standing in that doorway with his arms braced on either side of the frame, utterly unmovable, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, something that wanted very much to be hope. She woke early, as she always did, to Clara's hunger, and by the time the baby had been fed and the morning light was coming soft and pale through the muslin curtains, Henrietta had already made a decision. She was not going to be a woman who waited for circumstances to arrange themselves. She was going to be useful. She found the kitchen before anyone else was up, got the fire in the stove going, and started a pot of coffee. Peter found her there at 6:30, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment with an expression of what she could only describe as surprised appreciation. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and handed him a cup. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the same back garden she could see from her room, and she noticed for the first time that there were things out there that needed attention: the tomato plants leaning without stakes, a row of beans that had gotten tall and tangled. "Your garden could use some help," she said. He glanced back at her with a slightly rueful expression. "I'm better with the inside of the house than the outside of it. I grew up on a farm," she said. "If you have spare stakes and twine, I can fix those tomatoes." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't owe me labor for the room, Henrietta." "I know that too," she said. "I just like to do things." Something in his expression warmed, subtly but genuinely. "Stakes and twine are in the shed past the garden. Help yourself." That morning she worked in the kitchen garden, while Clara slept in a wooden crate she had padded with a folded blanket and set in the shade near the back step. And she staked the tomato, and tied back the beans, and pulled weeks of volunteer grass from between the carrot rows. And the work felt good in a way that work always felt good when you had been idle too long, the particular satisfaction of making something better than you found it. Peter came out twice. The first time he brought her a glass of water without comment. The second time he sat on the back step with his coffee and watched her work for a while. And they talked, in the easy fragmentary way of people engaged in parallel occupations. She learned that he had come to Caldwell from Ohio 5 years ago, that he had bought the boarding house from a man who had gotten sick of the border country and wanted to go home, that he had a younger sister in Columbus who wrote him letters he answered faithfully if infrequently. He had been in the cavalry briefly in his late 20s, which explained the way he stood and something of the particular quality of his attention. He was 32 years old and had never been married, and when she asked him that, straightforwardly, the way she had found it was easier to ask most things, he was quiet for a moment before saying that there had never quite been the right time or the right person, and the way he said it contained no self-pity and no particular regret, just honest acknowledgement. She told him about the farm in Missouri where she had grown up, the youngest of 4 children, all the rest boys, which meant she had learned to work hard and argue her corner and not wait for someone else to do the thing that needed doing. She told him about her mother, who had died of fever when Henrietta was 16, and her father, who had lasted 3 more years before following her. She did not tell him about Calhoun Briggs beyond what had already been established, and he did not ask. By noon the garden looked genuinely cared for, and Henrietta was sweaty and satisfied and had dirt on her knees and wrists, and she sat on the back step beside Peter to drink a second glass of water and felt, in a way that surprised her with its completeness, comfortable. Not comfortable like she had forgotten where she was or what had happened, but comfortable the way you feel when something fits, when the shape of a moment matches something internal. Clara woke up in her crate and announced her existence, and Peter leaned forward to look at the baby with an expression that struck Henrietta as unexpectedly soft for a man who presented otherwise as primarily practical. "She looks like you," he said. "People say she has her father's hair," Henrietta said, carefully neutral. "The eyes are yours," Peter said. "The way she's looking at everything, like she's taking inventory." Henrietta laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised you by arriving. I suppose she is. Peter smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed his face considerably. There was a warmth in it that the rest of his expression kept fairly well contained, the kind of warmth that you had to earn the sight of, and she understood instinctively that most people did not see it often. She filed that away without quite knowing why. Calhoun Briggs came back on Thursday. He came on foot this time, which was worse in a way, because it meant he had been thinking about it. He walked in through the front door of the boarding house in the middle of the afternoon, with the particular contained belligerence of a man who has rehearsed what he intends to say. Henrietta was in the dining room helping Mrs. Hatch sort through a confusion of letters, and she looked up when the door opened and felt her stomach clench in the precise animal way that 2 years of marriage to Calhoun Briggs had trained it to. He was a big man, broad-faced, somewhere north of 40 now, with the kind of settled confidence that came from having his own way consistently for a long time. He was well dressed because he always was, and he was wearing his anger like a well-fitted coat. "Henrietta," he said. She stood up slowly from the table. Mrs. Hatch looked between them and wisely became very still. "Calhoun," Henrietta said, "you're coming home." He said it as a statement of fact. "I am not," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. He took 2 steps into the room, and she took a step back and then stopped herself from taking another because she had made a decision 6 weeks ago and she was going to hold it. "That's my daughter you've got." His eyes went to Clara, who was in the sling against Henrietta's chest, awake and serious-faced. "She's my daughter," Henrietta said, "and she stays with me. I'll have the sheriff on you before nightfall." "You're welcome to try." Her heart was hammering, but her voice remained level. "And I'm welcome to tell the sheriff exactly how I came to have this bruise on my face, and several others he won't be able to see." Something shifted in Calhoun's expression, a slight contraction, the look of a man briefly calculating risk. Peter came through the door from the back of the house. He had clearly heard voices, because he arrived without hurry but with that quality of complete attention that was becoming familiar to Henrietta, and he positioned himself between Calhoun Briggs and the rest of the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided what was going to happen. "Mr. Briggs," he said, and the fact that he knew the name told Calhoun clearly that Henrietta had been talking. "You're a guest in this establishment, which means you're subject to the rules of it. The rules include treating residents with respect. Mrs. Norris is a resident." "She's my wife," Calhoun said. "She has identified herself to me as a woman who has left her husband," Peter said. "In the absence of any legal documentation to the contrary, that's how she stands here." Calhoun's face darkened. "You have no idea who you're talking to." "I have a pretty clear picture," Peter said, and his eyes moved briefly to the bruise on Henrietta's face and then back to Calhoun, and the message of that glance was entirely clear. Calhoun Briggs was not a stupid man. He was a man who understood leverage and who understood when he did not currently have enough of it. He looked at Peter Sutton for a long moment with the calculation of a man who was adding up facts and not liking the total. "This isn't finished," he said. "Maybe not," Peter said, "but it's finished for today. I'd appreciate you leaving." Calhoun looked at Henrietta one more time, with an expression that was meant to be proprietary and landed more as desperate, and she met his eyes without flinching, which she knew cost him something, because she had learned exactly what it cost him when she stopped being afraid. He left. Henrietta sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had gone slightly unsteady, and Peter crouched in front of her at eye level with an expression of careful attention. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She breathed in once, slow and full. "Thank you again." "You held your own," he said. "I just stood there." "That's not all you did," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded once. "He might try the sheriff. You should know that. It's possible a judge could be found who would rule in a husband's favor." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm not going back, Peter, whatever it costs." He held her gaze, and something passed between them that was more than the moment required, something that had been building quietly, the way temperature builds before a storm. "You won't have to face it alone," he said. He said it simply, not dramatically, not with any visible awareness of what it meant, and yet it settled over Henrietta like something warm and solid, and she felt tears behind her eyes for the first time since she had arrived, not from despair, but from the strangeness of being spoken to that way. She blinked them back, because Clara chose that moment to make a noise of supreme indifference to the adult world and its complications, and both of them looked at the baby simultaneously, and the tension broke into something that was almost a laugh. "She has excellent timing," Peter said. "She really does," Henrietta agreed. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Henrietta found herself settling into with a naturalness that both surprised and comforted her. She helped with breakfast in the mornings and tended the kitchen garden, and helped Mrs. Hatch with her letters, and did small mending jobs for the other boarders, who paid her modestly for the work, which mattered to her independence more than the amount itself suggested. Abilene Jack, the young cowboy from the stockyards, developed a cheerful worship of Clara that expressed itself primarily in faces and noises made across the dinner table, which Clara received with the dignified bemusement of an infant who has not yet decided whether the world is funny or simply very strange. Mrs. Hatch, who had raised 5 children of her own, occasionally took Clara for an hour in the afternoons while Henrietta worked, an arrangement that benefited both of them, and that Henrietta accepted with genuine gratitude. Dolores, who came in on Mondays and Wednesdays to cook and do laundry, was a Mexican woman in her 40s who had a direct manner that Henrietta respected immediately, and who, after about 4 days, adopted Henrietta with the brisk warmth of a woman who has decided someone is worth the investment. "You should eat more," Dolores told her on her 3rd Wednesday, handing her a second helping without asking. "You are too thin. How do you feed the baby if you do not eat?" "I eat," Henrietta said. "Not enough." Dolores looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who has seen hardship and is not confused by it. "Where is the husband?" Henrietta told her briefly. Dolores made a sound that encompassed the entire history of women married to difficult men, a sound of comprehensive unsurprise. "You are better off here," she said, "and Mr. Sutton, he will not let harm come to you." "He's been very kind," Henrietta said, and was aware that the word kind was not entirely the right one, was somehow insufficient. Dolores looked at her with the expression of a woman who sees a great deal more than she comments on. "Kind," she repeated. "Yes." The evenings were Peter's time, in the way that mornings and afternoons were full of the business of the house. After dinner, when the boarders dispersed to their various intentions, Peter usually sat at the end of the dining table with whatever needed his attention, accounts or correspondence or maintenance records, and Henrietta began, without any particular planning, to sit across from him and read or sew or simply keep company, with Clara sleeping in her crate nearby. They talked in the evenings. Gradually, then more freely, the way water finds its way through stone, not all at once but persistently, and with a kind of inevitability. He told her about Ohio and about the cavalry years, about a battle at the Washita River in 1868 that he had been present for, and that had left him with a complicated silence about certain things that she understood without pushing. He told her about the winter that had nearly bankrupted the boarding house and the spring that had saved it. He told her small things, the kind of things that indicate trust, that he preferred coffee to tea and disliked horses that showed their teeth, and had been reading the same novel for 4 months because he kept falling asleep after 2 pages. She told him about growing up with 3 older brothers and the particular education that provided in terms of not being intimidated, and about how she had loved to draw as a girl and had given it up without quite noticing, letting it slip the way women let things slip when their lives fill with other people's needs. She told him about the early months of Clara's life, when Calhoun's behavior had gone from bad to something worse, and she told it simply without asking for anything in return, just because it was true, and because speaking it to someone who listened properly felt like setting down something heavy. He listened with his whole attention, the way some people do and most people don't, and he did not offer solutions to things that didn't need solutions, and he did not tell her what he thought she should have done differently, and these absences were, she found, as meaningful as anything he said. She was not thinking about falling in love. She had more practical matters pressing, the question of what her legal situation with Calhoun actually was, the question of where she would eventually go, the question of what she was going to build for herself and Clara in a world that did not offer women alone an easy path. She was thinking about those things, genuinely and practically. But she was also, without meaning to particularly, noticing the way Peter Sutton moved through his own house, with the ease of a man who has made a home and knows every inch of it. Noticing the way he spoke to the boarders, each of them slightly differently, attending to what each one actually needed. Noticing his hands when he was working, the competence and care in them. Noticing, on the evenings when he laughed at something she said, the way the room felt different when that happened. She told herself none of this was relevant. She was not entirely convincing. 3 weeks after her arrival, Calhoun Briggs came back with the county sheriff. It was a Sunday morning, quiet with the plains quiet that Henrietta had begun to love, and the sound of horses in front of the boarding house brought Peter to the front window first and Henrietta right behind him, and they both looked out at Calhoun on his horse and the sheriff on his, and Calhoun's expression had the particular quality of a man who has obtained an official advantage and intends to press it. Sheriff Delaney was a narrow man in his 50s with a weathered face and an expression of professional neutrality. He came inside when Peter opened the door, removed his hat, and addressed Henrietta directly, which surprised her. "Mrs. Briggs," he began. "Norris," she said quietly. "I'm using my maiden name." The sheriff looked at her for a moment, then at the bruise, which had faded now to yellow-green but was still visible if you were looking. She had a feeling he was looking. "Mr. Briggs is claiming the right to his child," the sheriff said. "He may claim whatever he likes," Henrietta said. "My daughter and I are both safe here. We are not causing trouble. He's her legal father." "He is. I have not disputed that. I have left, Sheriff, which I believe I am within my rights to do. I have not taken anything that belonged to him. I have taken myself and my daughter. In Kansas, ma'am, the law generally favors the father in questions of custody." "The law," Peter said from beside her, and his voice was measured but firm, "also takes into account the welfare of a child and the circumstances of the home environment." He looked at the sheriff steadily. "If it comes to a hearing, Mrs. Norris will have witnesses and documentation of what she left and why. I imagine Mr. Briggs might find that examination less comfortable than the one he's proposing." Sheriff Delaney was quiet for a moment. He looked at Calhoun through the window, then back at Peter, then at Henrietta. He was, she thought, not actually a bad man. He was a man in an uncomfortable position, and he was trying to see all of it. "There's a circuit judge comes through in 6 weeks, he said finally. "If Mr. Briggs wants to press a legal claim for custody, he can do it then properly, with proper legal proceedings." He looked at Henrietta. "Until then, if you're residing here peacefully and the child is cared for, I don't see my authority extending to removing anyone from their current lodgings." He put his hat back on and went outside and said something to Calhoun that they could not hear through the window. Calhoun's face went through several interesting colors. He looked once more at the boarding house at the window where Henrietta stood, and she held his gaze because she had decided some weeks ago that she was going to keep holding his gaze. He rode away. 6 weeks, Henrietta said. 6 weeks, Peter confirmed. He turned to look at her and she turned to look at him, and they were standing very close together in front of the window, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the steady reliability of his presence. "I need a lawyer," she said. "There's one in Wichita who's worth hiring, Tom Abernethy. He's handled cases like this before." Peter hesitated. "I can write to him today if you want. The stage goes out tomorrow morning." She looked at him, this man who kept doing things, practical and concrete and quietly generous without making a ceremony of it. "Peter," she said, "why are you doing all of this?" He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his expression became less contained than usual, something opening that he ordinarily kept carefully organized. "Because it matters," he said. "You matter. What happens to you matters." It was not a declaration. It was something more honest than that. It was a statement of fact from a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and she received it that way entirely, and felt it settle in somewhere that had been cold for a very long time. "Thank you," she said softly. "Right, Abernethy?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Right, Abernethy." The weeks that followed were a period of dual tension, the legal threat on one side and the quiet daily accumulation of something else entirely on the other. Tom Abernethy wrote back from Wichita with reassurance that the case was not hopeless, and with a list of things Henrietta should document, and she spent 3 evenings writing it all down. All of it, carefully and clearly, and Peter read it over for her at her request and said nothing but held her hand briefly after he finished, just once briefly, and then released it. She thought about that for 2 days. Abilene Jack got into a fight at the saloon over a card game, and came home with a split lip and the sheepish expression of a young man who knows he has been foolish. And Henrietta cleaned his lip in the kitchen and lectured him mildly about the specific combination of liquor and gambling that had been causing problems in cattle towns since before either of them was born. And he took it with the good grace of someone who is privately relieved to be scolded, because scolding indicates someone cares. Peter overheard part of it from the hallway and afterward told her she had sounded exactly like a school teacher, which he said with admiration rather than condescension, and she threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. Of course he caught it. Mrs. Hatch's son finally wrote with travel arrangements, and the old woman's relief was so profound it almost radiated heat. And Henrietta helped her pack her things and sat with her the evening before she left and listened to her talk about her son and her grandchildren in Nebraska. And when Mrs. Hatch said, at the end of the evening, that she thought Henrietta was going to be all right, it meant something particular because Mrs. Hatch was a woman who had seen enough of the world to have an informed opinion. Dolers taught Henrietta how to make the proper chili Colorado that she had grown up with in Sonora, insisting that the chili paste had to be made from dried red chilies soaked overnight and not from any powder, and standing over Henrietta's shoulder with the critical attention of someone who takes the transmission of culinary knowledge seriously. And when it came out, Wright Dolers tasted it and nodded with the satisfaction of a craftsman whose apprentice has done the thing correctly. Peter ate 2 bowls of it at dinner and complimented it with genuine enthusiasm, and Dolers pointed to Henrietta and said, "She made it." And Peter looked at Henrietta across the table with an expression that she had begun to recognize as one of the better ones in his repertoire. Clara, meanwhile, was becoming herself. She had begun to smile, genuinely and specifically, and she smiled most reliably for Henrietta and for Peter. And the second category of that information was something Henrietta filed away alongside other categories of information she was accumulating without fully acknowledging the project. One evening in the 4th week after dinner, Peter asked her if she would like to walk with him. There was something slightly formal about the way he asked it, a care in it, and she said yes with a directness that she thought she saw briefly surprise him. They walked down the main street of Caldwell in the late light of a Kansas summer evening, Peter carrying Clara while Henrietta walked beside him with her hands loose at her sides. And the light was that particular golden quality that makes everything look chosen. And people they passed nodded or spoke, and Peter introduced Henrietta without any qualifier or explanation, just by name. And the simplicity of that, the uncomplicated social fact of it, affected her more than it should have and exactly as much as it did. "Do you ever miss Ohio?" she asked him. He thought about it. "Sometimes, in the winter mostly. The winters here are hard." He looked around at the wide, flat country, the sky enormous in all directions. But I chose this. It suits me. The space, she said, because she understood it. Yes, and the work. This place needs things, needs people who will stay. Most people are just passing through, she said. Most people are, he agreed. But some stay. He looked at her sideways, and the look had something in it, something he was feeling his way toward. She did not look away. Henrietta, he said, and stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to face him. Clara was asleep against his chest, one small fist curled against his shirt, and the picture of it did something profound and disorganizing to Henrietta's carefully maintained composure. I don't want to say the wrong thing, he said. Given everything you've been through, and given that there's a legal situation that hasn't resolved itself yet, I don't want to. He stopped. Tried again. You've been here a month, and I want you to know that I'm aware that what you need most right now is stability, not complications, and I don't intend to be a complication. Peter, she said. I'm getting to something, he said, but I want to be careful about it. I know you're getting to something, she said. I've been watching you get to it for 2 weeks. He looked at her, and something shifted in his face, a kind of surprised and relieved recognition. Have you? I have, she said. And for what it's worth, I've been getting to something too, slowly, because I've been careful for reasons you understand, but I've been getting to it. The evening light was turning orange now, and the town was settling into its nighttime sounds, and Clara breathed slowly against Peter's chest, and he looked at Henrietta Norris with everything he had been keeping organized and contained, and let it be visible. I think I'm in love with you, he said. I think it's been happening since about Tuesday of your first week, when you came out to the kitchen and made the coffee. She felt it, the complete sentence of him, the honest weight of it. That was a good morning, she said softly. It was, he said. She stepped forward and kissed him because she had decided things for herself for long enough to know that when something was true, you should say so, and this was the truest thing she knew how to say right now. He kissed her back, carefully, tenderly, with Clara still asleep between them, and when they drew apart his eyes were bright with something that looked a great deal like joy. Clara is going to be annoyed that she slept through this, he said. Henrietta laughed, and the laugh went all the way through her, free and full, and she thought that she was going to remember this moment for the rest of her life. The orange light and the sleeping baby and this man looking at her like she was something wonderful. Tom Abernethy arrived from Wichita 2 days before the circuit judge was due. A compact, quick-eyed man in his 40s, who went through Henrietta's documentation with the focused attention of a man who was building something, asking questions and making notes. And when he was done, he said that he believed the case was solid, and that Calhoun Briggs was going to find the hearing significantly less favorable than he expected. The hearing was held in the courthouse, which was a generous term for a building that served multiple civic functions and had been a saloon until 3 years prior. The circuit judge was a tall, dry man named Hargreaves who had been doing his circuit for 15 years and who had, Abernethy assured Henrietta, a reputation for fairness over convenience. Calhoun Briggs arrived with his own attorney, a man from Comanche County who was polished and confident, and he looked across the room at Henrietta with an expression that was meant to be intimidating, and which landed considerably less effectively than it once would have. Peter sat directly behind Henrietta, and the solid presence of him at her back was not a crutch. She knew the difference, but a chosen comfort, the way you carry something that matters to you not because you need to, but because it belongs with you. The hearing took most of the morning. Abernethy presented Henrietta's documentation, her account written in her own careful hand, the testimony of Dr. Eland from the town she had last stopped in before Caldwell, who had treated her for a fractured rib 3 months ago and had written a sworn statement that she carried with her. Abernethy presented the testimony of Mrs. Hatch, obtained by letter and properly witnessed. He presented a record of Clara's current health and welfare, attested by the Caldwell doctor who had seen the baby 2 weeks prior at Henrietta's request for exactly this purpose. Calhoun's attorney argued the legal presumption of paternal rights with considerable fluency, and some specific citations of Kansas statutes that made Abernethy's eyes go briefly sharp before he rebutted them point by point. Judge Hargreaves asked questions, directly, specifically, without ceremony. He asked Henrietta to describe the circumstances of her departure, and she did, clearly, without embellishment but without softening, and she heard the courtroom breathe differently when certain parts were said aloud. He asked Calhoun Briggs whether he disputed the account. Calhoun disputed it in the general sense while being unable to dispute the specific details. Judge Hargreaves was quiet for a long while. Then he said that the welfare of the child was the paramount consideration of the court in such matters, that the documented history of physical harm to the child's mother was a material factor in determining what that welfare required, and that he was granting primary custody to Henrietta Norris, with the further directive that Calhoun Briggs was to make no attempt to approach or contact Mrs. Norris or the child without the intermediary of the court. The relief was so profound that Henrietta's hands went still in her lap, and she sat perfectly straight and breathed in once, and then felt Peter's hand on her shoulder from behind, steady and warm. Outside the courthouse, in the afternoon light, Abernethy shook her hand and told her she had been an excellent client. Calhoun passed them on his way to his horse and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the last one she ever intended to allow him, and she returned it with the composure of a woman who has just had the law stand on her side for the first time, and he looked away first. He was gone from Caldwell before evening. She stood with Peter in the street outside the courthouse and breathed the hot Kansas air and felt the particular lightness of something that had been sitting on her chest for months being lifted away completely. "Clara is yours," Peter said. "Clara was always mine," Henrietta said. "Now it's simply official." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him for a moment, just a moment, and then straightened and looked up at him with everything clear in her face. "I need to think about what comes next," she said. "You don't have to think about it right now," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not right this minute." What came next unfolded in its own time, the way things do when the urgency is finally gone, and there is room for something careful and real. Peter did not rush her, and she did not rush herself, and the love between them, which had been building in the evenings at the dining table and in the kitchen mornings and in the garden, and in every quiet conversation and every moment of laughter and every glance held a half-second longer than strictly necessary, was allowed to simply be what it was. He asked her one evening in September, sitting on the back step in the cooling air while Clara pulled herself to a sitting position in the grass a few feet away with the intense concentration of a person solving a significant engineering problem, whether she had thought about what she wanted her life to look like. "Generally or specifically," she said. "Both." She was quiet for a moment, honest with herself before she was honest with him. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I didn't expect that, but it's true. I have made it into something for myself here, and Clara has a home here." She paused. "And you are here." He looked at her sidelong, that warm, careful quality in his expression. "I've been thinking about a specific question," he said. "I've been thinking about the right time to ask it." "Ask it," she said. He turned to face her fully, and there was something both serious and quietly glad in him. "Will you marry me, Henrietta?" She had known it was coming. She had known it for weeks, had felt it in the texture of things, in the particular way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing, in the way he spoke about the future in terms of we without seeming to realize he was doing it. She had known it and had been honest with herself about her own answer well in advance. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it longer than he intended to, and she laughed and he laughed, and Clara, distracted from her engineering project by the change in atmosphere, looked up at them both with an expression of infant uncertainty that only made them laugh more. "She thinks we've lost our minds," Peter said. "We probably have," Henrietta agreed. "Somewhat." He took her hand and held it, and they sat in the September evening watching Clara investigate the grass, and Caldwell went about its business around them, horses and voices and the distant sound of the saloon, and the enormous Kansas sky turned colors above them. And Henrietta felt, with a completeness she had not believed possible a few months ago, that she had arrived somewhere real. They were married in October, by the minister of the small Methodist church at the edge of town. A quiet ceremony with dolers as witness and Abilene Jack standing up for Peter, and wearing his best shirt with the intensity of a young man who takes the obligation of best shirts very seriously. The cattle buyer from Wichita, who happened to be in town on business, attended on the theory that he had eaten 100 dinners at the boarding house table and felt personally invested. Clara was present in Doler's arms, wearing a white dress that Henrietta had made from a piece of muslin she had found in the dry goods store, and she was in excellent spirits, which everyone took as a good sign. Henrietta wore a dress of dark green wool that she had also made herself, having decided that her first real choice of clothing in a very long time was going to be something she loved. And she stood next to Peter Sutton in the small white church, with the autumn light coming through the plain glass windows, and made her promises with the fullness of a woman who has chosen something rather than fallen into it. Peter made his promises with the straightforward honesty he brought to everything, and he slid a plain gold band onto her finger that he had gotten from the jeweler in Wichita, and which fit perfectly, which seemed, in some small way, like a sign. When the minister pronounced them married, Peter kissed her with the warmth and gentleness that she had come to know was the full truth of him underneath the practicality, and dolers made a sound of satisfaction that echoed in the small church, and Abilene Jack whistled before remembering where he was and composing himself. They had a wedding dinner at the boarding house, which dolers cooked, an extraordinary spread that drew several other Caldwell residents who had been invited, and who came bearing small gifts and genuine goodwill, because a boarding house is a kind of neighborhood institution, and Peter Sutton had been a good neighbor, and the woman he had chosen was already known and liked. Henrietta sat at the table where she had eaten her first dinner in Caldwell, the long plain table with the tin cups and the candle in the middle, now with more candles and flowers that someone had found, and looked around at the faces of people who were becoming, without ceremony or formality, her people, and felt a gratitude that was bigger than any specific object. Peter, beside her, touched her hand under the table. She laced her fingers through his. Winter came to the Kansas plains with the particular ferocity that Peter had warned her about, the wind coming down from the north with nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles, the kind of cold that required serious preparation and respect. Henrietta, who had grown up in Missouri winters, was not unprepared, but the scale of a plains winter was its own thing entirely, and she found herself in the first weeks of December genuinely awed by it. The boarding house held warmth against it, the big stove in the kitchen that she learned to manage with precision, the way the wood had to be stacked and the drafts tended, and she and Peter ran the house together with the complementary competence of two people who are good at different things and have learned each other's rhythms. New boarders came through the winter, different people passing through or staying for the season, and the house was full enough to keep them busy and quiet enough for the evenings to remain theirs. Clara took her first steps in December, 3 unsteady lurching steps across the kitchen floor toward Peter, who was crouched at her level with his arms out, and his face wearing the expression of a man who has temporarily set aside everything serious in order to be completely available to the miracle of an infant learning to walk. And Clara made it to him and grabbed his hands and stood there with an expression of profound self-congratulation, while both her parents made the kind of noise that parents make. He had taken to fatherhood, Henrietta thought, the way he took to most things, with a quiet thoroughness and an investment of genuine care. He told Clara stories sometimes in the evenings, sitting with her on his knee, simple stories about horses and plains, and the places he had seen, spoken in the low, steady voice that reliably put her to sleep and that Henrietta found, listening from across the room, one of the more peaceful sounds she had encountered. Spring came with the specific relief of a Kansas spring, which arrives not gradually, but in a sudden burst of green and warmth that makes the preceding winter feel like a terrible dream that is now completely over. The kitchen garden came back to life and Henrietta expanded it, adding rows of squash and more beans, and a section of herbs that she had wanted the previous year and had now planned properly. She had also, in the winter months, taken out her pencils again. She had found them in the very bottom of her carpet bag, left over from a life she had been living when she was a different version of herself, and she had looked at them for a long time before beginning to draw. Clara first, because that was the most obvious subject and the most compelling one. Then Peter, though she did not show him for a while. Then the back garden and the window in her room, now their room with its particular quality of morning light. She showed him the drawings one evening in February, all of them laid out on the table, and he looked at them with an attention that she recognized as his genuine response to things rather than the polite response, and he was quiet for a while. "These are extraordinary," he said. "They're just drawings," she said. "No," he said. "They're not." He looked at the one of Clara walking across the kitchen, and then at the one of himself sitting reading, captured from across the room in a moment he hadn't known was being recorded. "You drew me." "Several times," she admitted. He looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen before, a moved quality, as if being drawn was the most specific kind of being seen, and it had reached something in him that most things didn't reach. "I didn't know you were doing this," he said. "I didn't know I was going to," she said. "It just started again." "Good," he said. "Don't stop." She didn't stop. She drew all through that spring and into the summer, filling a small journal he had gotten her with pages of Caldwell and Clara and Peter and Dolors and Abilene Jack, who had stayed on through the winter and taken a more permanent job at the stockyards, and who had grown considerably less swaggering and more settled in the months at the boarding house. The way young men do when they find themselves in an environment of actual adults who treat them with consistent respect. In late spring, Henrietta knew something before she said it, that particular knowing that women carry before it becomes information for anyone else. She was certain for 2 weeks before she told Peter, partly because she was making sure and partly because she wanted a moment of holding it privately, this thing that was hers and his together. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were alone in the kitchen and Clara was sleeping late. He turned from the stove where he was making coffee and looked at her, and she watched him understand it, watched it move across his face in stages, first comprehension and then something so unguarded and bright that it filled the room. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with every atom of what he felt, this steady and capable man who kept the warmest parts of himself for the moments when they were genuinely warranted. "You are going to be the death of me," he said quietly, "in the very best way." She laughed and pressed her forehead to his, and they stood like that in the morning kitchen, while the coffee came to a boil and somewhere in the house, Clara began to announce her awakening, and the world was exactly the size it needed to be. The summer of 1883 in Caldwell was a full one. The cattle business was thriving along the Kishom Trail, and the boarding house had more business than it could easily handle, and Henrietta managed the additional work with the pragmatic efficiency that had become her defining characteristic in the eyes of the town, which now thought of her, she had come to understand, as simply a fixed and necessary part of the landscape. Dolors, who was perhaps the most pleased by the pregnancy of anyone except the 2 people most directly involved, arrived more often than her scheduled days and contributed opinions and instructions in equal measure, many of which were extremely useful and all of which were delivered with authority. "She has to rest," Dolors told Peter with the certainty of someone delivering established medical opinion. "I know," Peter said. "She does not rest," Dolors said. "I know," Peter said again. "She is stubborn," Dolors added. "She's right here," Henrietta said from across the kitchen. This exchange, or variations of it, recurred throughout the summer with the comfortable familiarity of something that has become a household joke, and the underlying truth of it, which was that people who loved Henrietta worried about her because she consistently overestimated her own capacity for overwork, was something she was learning slowly to accept. Peter was good at managing it without managing her, which was the specific skill required. He noticed when she was tired and suggested specific rest in terms of the house's needs rather than her personal well-being, suggesting that the accounts could wait until morning, or that the garden looked like it was managing fine for another day. And she understood what he was doing and was grateful for the form of it, the disguise of practicality over concern, which gave her the option of accepting without it feeling like concession. In August, a family came through on their way west who had been traveling for 3 months and were exhausted in the bone-deep way of people who have been moving too long, and they stayed at the boarding house for a week, and Henrietta fed them and helped the mother, a quiet young woman named Caroline who was not much younger than herself, managed the 2 small children who needed managing, and felt while doing it a complicated recognition of where she had been a year ago and of what had changed. Caroline asked her on their last evening how she had come to be in Caldwell, and Henrietta told her the shortened version, the version that got to the truth without requiring the full inventory of details, and Caroline listened with the expression of a woman who recognized certain elements from her own experience. "You're braver than I am," Caroline said. "I don't think it was bravery exactly," Henrietta said. "I think it was that I ran out of alternatives." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Caroline said. Henrietta thought about that for a while. She thought about it later that night, lying awake while Peter slept beside her, one hand resting over her stomach where the baby was making its presence known in increasingly definitive ways. And she thought about the woman she had been a year and a half ago, walking down the main street of Caldwell with a baby and a Bruise and a carpet bag that was barely holding anything at all, and about the door that had opened and the man who had stood in it. She thought about how close it had all been, how much could have gone differently. Another town, another boarding house, a different man in that doorway. She put her hand over Peter's where it lay on the pillow between them, and he shifted slightly in his sleep and turned toward her. And she lay in the dark of the room she had come to as a stranger and thought about luck and courage, and the specific mercy of arriving in the right place at the right time, and felt something that was larger than gratitude and more personal than luck, a settled and complete feeling of having been found by one's own life. Their son was born in October of 1883, on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by the Caldwell doctor and attended by dolors, who proved to be invaluable in a capacity that exceeded even her previous demonstrations of usefulness. Peter waited in the front room in a state of controlled anguish that Abilene Jack, who had been pulled into proximity by the circumstances of the house, attempted to alleviate by playing cards with him, an effort that was kind if not entirely effective. The baby arrived with the full-throated opinion of someone who has strong views about the outside world, and when the doctor came to the front room and told Peter that he had a son and that Henrietta was well, Peter sat down in his chair with the posture of a man whose structural integrity has been briefly tested. Abilene Jack, to his credit, said nothing and simply refilled the coffee. Peter came in to see them, the baby and Henrietta together, and he stood in the doorway of the room for a moment with an expression that she would later try to draw and find she couldn't quite capture, because it was made of too many simultaneous things, love and relief and wonder, and something that was simply the complete inability to contain what he was feeling. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was very new and very opinionated and very unimpressed with the world so far, and then at Henrietta, who was tired in the profound way of having done the most extraordinary physical thing, and was regarding both of them with an expression of exhausted and uncomplicated happiness. "He's perfect," Peter said. "He has your nose," Henrietta said. Peter looked at his son's small, scrunched face with the concentration of a man conducting a genuine assessment. "He has your chin," he decided. "We can argue about this for the next 20 years, she said. "Longer," he said. He looked at her, all the way at her, with everything. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for all of it." She reached up and touched his face, this face she knew so well now that she had drawn a dozen times and would draw 100 more. "We did all of it together," she said. "I know," he said. "I still want to say thank you." They named the baby William, for Peter's father, with Henry as a middle name for Henrietta's. And Caldwell received the news with the warmth of a community that had been watching this particular story with its whole attention and felt personally invested in how it turned out. Dolores made a feast that she brought to the boarding house and served to everyone who came through, which was a substantial number of people, because the main street of Caldwell had decided that this was an occasion worth celebrating and acted accordingly. Abilene Jack held William with the focused care of a young man holding something precious and fragile, and his expression was so earnest and careful that Henrietta felt a specific fondness for him that was almost maternal despite the fact that he was only 4 years younger than herself. "He looks wise," Abilene Jack said, regarding the baby. "He looks like a baby," Peter said. "He can be both," Henrietta said. Clara, who was now a year and a half old and a person of definite opinions and considerable mobility, regarded her new brother with the judicious interest of someone assessing a new variable in a familiar equation. She patted his head once, very gently, with the concentrated care of a small child doing an important thing, and then went back to her own business, which Henrietta took as an auspicious beginning. The boarding house went on. It went on through the winter of 1883 and the spring of 1884, through Caldwell's ongoing negotiations with its own nature as a border town, through the cattle seasons and the dry seasons, and the seasons of plains weather that required the respect of anyone who intended to remain. It went on as a place where people stopped, and some of them stayed, and the ones who stayed added themselves to the texture of the life that Henrietta and Peter had built there. Abilene Jack stayed. He had become so thoroughly a part of the household that any other arrangement had ceased to be imaginable, and he helped with things around the boarding house in addition to his stockyard work, and grew into a young man who was considerably more than the swaggering 20-year-old who had arrived and was still growing. He talked about sending for his mother from Louisiana someday, when he had enough put by, and Henrietta encouraged this with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had learned the value of having people. Dolores remained as essential as ever and became, in the way these things happen when they are allowed to, something closer to family than employee, the kind of relationship that does not fit neatly into categories but is nonetheless real for that. The Caldwell doctor, who had delivered William and who kept a professional eye on both children with obvious fondness, was a regular dinner guest on Thursday evenings, a habit that had begun practically and continued by mutual preference. The boarding house itself changed somewhat. Peter added a room on the eastern side in the spring of 1884, having identified the need and planned for it through the winter, and Henrietta drew up the design with him at the dining table over several evenings, a process that involved considerable discussion and negotiation, and was one of the better times she could remember, two people building something together in every sense. She was drawing professionally by then, a thing she had not planned but which had followed naturally from the way people responded to what she made. She drew portraits primarily, for families who wanted to remember a face, or for young men who wanted to send something home to parents who were far away. She charged modestly and worked carefully, and the income, added to the boarding house revenue, gave them a solidity that felt like something she had helped construct rather than fallen into. She drew Clara and William often in the margins of other work, quick true sketches that caught them in their particular moments of childness. Clara reading with her serious face, William discovering his hands with the focused wonder of the very young. The two of them together, which was a subject of infinite variation because children together are never still and always interesting. Peter, she drew most of all. She had a whole journal of him now, 3 years of the same face in different lights and different moments, and she thought sometimes that she could have drawn him from memory with her eyes closed, that the map of his face was as familiar to her as anything in the world. He found the journal once and looked through it with an expression she recognized as the same one he had made the first time she had shown him her drawings, that moved and specific quality of being genuinely seen. "There are a lot of these," he said. "There are," she agreed. "I don't think I look like this," he said. "You look exactly like that," she said. "I have been looking at you for 3 years and I draw what I see." He looked at one particular drawing for a long moment, one she had made of him sitting on the back step in the early morning with his coffee, in the summer light with the garden behind him and a quality of simple contentment in his whole person. "Is that how I look?" he said quietly. "When you're happy," she said. "Yes." He put the journal down and looked at her with that open warmth that she had learned was the most honest version of him. "I am happy," he said, in case there was any question. "There wasn't," she said, "but I'm glad to hear it said." In the summer of 1885, Henrietta discovered she was pregnant again. She told Peter in the kitchen again, because the kitchen was where important things seemed to get said in their life, and he reacted with a joy that was perhaps slightly less surprised this time but no less genuine, and he held her for a long moment with his face against her hair, and she held him back and they stood like that in the kitchen of the boarding house they had made together while the morning went on outside and the town of Caldwell went about its business. "2," he said. "3," she said. "Clara counts." "Of course Clara counts," he said. "I was counting from William." "3 then," she said. He pulled back and looked at her. "Are you well? You feel well?" "I feel very well," she said. "Better than the last time, I think." "Dolors is going to be insufferable," he said. "Dolors is going to be triumphant," Henrietta corrected. "Which is worse?" She was right on both counts. Dolors received the news with the satisfaction of someone whose domestic work has produced a visible return on investment, and her triumphance was total and entirely good-natured, and she increased both her frequency of attendance at the boarding house and the volume of her opinions on rest and nutrition, and Henrietta accepted all of it with the affection she felt for Dolors, which was substantial and real. The second baby came in February of 1886, a boy again, with red gold hair that surprised everyone except Henrietta, who had a grandmother with red hair and recognized where it had been waiting. They named him Thomas, and he was a different creature entirely from William, who had been serious from the first, arriving in the world with the cooperative good humor of someone who has decided in advance to make things as easy as possible for everyone. Clara, at 3½ received him with an authority that suggested she had decided the matter of siblings was going to be handled by her personally and efficiently. She appointed herself a supervisor of some informal kind and took the role seriously, which mostly manifested as narrating the baby's activities to nearby adults as though they might have missed relevant details. William, at 2, found Thomas primarily interesting as a potential audience, a function Thomas fulfilled with more enthusiasm than anyone had quite expected. The house was full and loud and warm, and the life in it was genuine, made of real things, hard work and good food and children's noise, and the specific pleasure of evenings when everything was quiet and settled, and 2 people could sit together in the peace of it. Henrietta sat in those evenings sometimes and thought about the word home, about what it meant and how it was made, not of buildings or geography, but of the specific accumulation of chosen things, of trust built steadily and care given consistently, and love that had grown from something careful and uncertain into something strong and particular, and entirely its own. She thought about the morning she had walked into this house with Clara against her chest, and a bruise on her face and a bag with almost nothing in it, and how she had stood in the middle of this room with a key in her hand, feeling the impossible tentative edge of safety for the first time in a very long time. She thought about the man who had stood in the doorway. Peter was sitting across from her now, as he sat so many evenings, going through the boarding house accounts with the focused attention of someone who takes the maintenance of a thing seriously. And he looked up as if he felt her looking at him, which she thought after 3 years was probably actually true. "What?" he said with the smile in his eyes that she loved best. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." "You're always looking," he said. "You're always worth looking at," she said. He set down his pen and regarded her with the full attention she had learned was one of the best things about him. "What are you thinking about?" "I arrived here," she said, 3.5 years ago. He was quiet for a moment, remembering it with her. "You looked like you'd fight God himself if he came through that door behind you," he said. She laughed. "I might have." "I'm glad you came here," he said. "I know it wasn't a choice exactly, not at first, but I'm glad." "It was a choice," she said. "Maybe not this specific door on this specific day, but every step that kept me moving instead of stopping and going back. Those were choices." She looked at him with everything she knew how to say with her face by now, all of it. "And this is the best thing I ever chose." He left his accounts where they were and came around the table and sat beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the quiet of the evening house, the children asleep down the hall and the Kansas night outside and the life they had made contained and full around them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy? Not just all right, not just managing, actually happy?" She considered it with the honesty it deserved. She thought about Clara's serious reading face and William's laugh and Thomas's cooperative good humor and Dolar's triumphant pronouncements, and Abilene Jack's careful hands holding a small baby and the smell of the kitchen in the morning, and the kitchen garden coming back in spring, and the drawings filling her journals, and the particular quality of light through the muslin curtains. She thought about Peter's voice telling stories to a sleepy child, about his hand in hers in a courthouse, about a gold ring that had fit perfectly, about a man in a doorway who had not moved. "Yes," she said. The word came out whole and complete, nothing missing from it. Completely. He pressed his lips to her hair and held her there in the quiet. And outside, the Kansas wind moved across the dark plains. And somewhere down the hall, Thomas made a small sound in his sleep and settled again. And the boarding house held all of them, solidly, in the way of a thing built to last. In the years that followed, Caldwell changed, as all cattle towns were changing in those years, the trails shifting and the open range closing as the decade moved toward its end, the barbed wire coming and the homesteaders arriving, the particular wildness of the border town giving way to something more settled. It was not always an easy change, and it was not always a clean one, and some of the things that were lost in it were worth mourning, but the essential fact of the plains remained: the sky and the space and the wind, and the people who had chosen to stay found that they had chosen a place that was genuinely theirs. Sutton's boarding house remained. It evolved, as Peter's practical intelligence found ways to adapt it, taking in more permanent residents as the transient cattle trade lessened, serving the families who were settling the surrounding land. Henrietta's drawings became a modest but real income, portraits sought by homesteading families who wanted records of themselves, and eventually a collection of her landscape drawings was displayed at the general store and caused a small sensation among people who did not know what to call what they were feeling but knew they felt it. Abilene Jack sent for his mother from Louisiana in the autumn of 1887, and she arrived on the stage with the wariness of a woman who has been told something wonderful and is waiting for the catch, and within a week had decided that Caldwell was acceptable, and within a month had become part of the life of the place in ways that Jack hadn't fully anticipated and Dolars had immediately recognized as inevitable, because people who belong somewhere recognize it when they arrive. Clara started school in the autumn of 1887, at 5 years old, and approached it with the methodical enthusiasm she brought to most things, coming home on the first day with a complete report on all of her classmates that demonstrated both her observational powers and her social instincts, both of which were considerable. William followed her 2 years later, and the two of them together at the school were known as children who were interesting to teach, which their teacher said to Henrietta with the tone of someone who means it as a genuine compliment and is aware it contains layers. Thomas was a different matter entirely, sunny and sociable and constitutionally disinclined to sit still, a quality that the school would have to accommodate when his time came, but which in the meantime expressed itself as a child who appeared to know everyone in Caldwell by name and who distributed his good humor freely and without discrimination, which made him extraordinarily popular among a wide range of adults who should perhaps have been less susceptible to the charms of a small child, but demonstrably were. Peter taught all three of them things that the school didn't: how to read a sky for weather, how to tend animals, how to keep accounts and think about the practical management of a thing you own. He taught them these things without ceremony, in the way of a man who believes that knowledge is best passed in the doing of it, and Henrietta watched him do it and felt the particular love you feel for someone when you see them being exactly who they are. She taught them to draw. Clara took to it with her usual focused seriousness and developed real skill. William was intermittently interested. Thomas drew everything immediately, quickly, and with great enthusiasm for quantity rather than quality, and the results were posted on the wall of the kitchen with complete impartiality. The wall of the kitchen eventually held other things as well, a record of the family and the house and the town as it changed. Henrietta's drawings of children at different ages, a portrait of Dolors that Dolors had declared too flattering and which Henrietta had insisted was accurate. A drawing of the back garden in summer, the tomatoes finally properly staked and thriving. A drawing of Peter standing in the front doorway of the boarding house on an ordinary morning, coffee in hand, looking out at the main street with the easy familiarity of a man who knows and is known by his place. She had drawn him in a doorway on purpose. He saw it when she put it up and stood looking at it for a long time, and she stood beside him. "You remember," he said. "I remember everything," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they both looked at the drawing, at the man in the doorway on that ordinary morning, and they were thinking about another morning, a summer afternoon in 1882, and the first time she had come through that door and everything that had happened after. "Thank you," she said, "for standing there." "You'd have found your way without me," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm very glad I didn't have to." He turned and looked at her, this woman he had known for 5 years now, who had arrived in his house with nothing but a baby and a bruise and more courage than she knew what to do with, who had made his house into a home and his life into a life worth living, who drew the world as she saw it and saw it with extraordinary accuracy. "So am I," he said, "every single day." That evening all 5 of them ate together at the long table, as they did every evening, the candle in the middle and the food that was good because it had been made with attention, and the children talked with the particular abundance of children who have been listened to consistently and therefore have a great deal to say, and Dolors arrived in time for dessert because she often did. And the table was full of light and sound, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of a life that had been chosen and built and inhabited by people who intended to keep it. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the endless Kansas wind moved outside, Henrietta and Peter sat at the end of the table in the amber light of the remaining candle, as they had sat on her first night in Caldwell, and she drank her tea and he drank his coffee and the boarding house breathed around them. "Same table," she said. "Same chairs," he said. "Different life," she said. He smiled, that full smile she had been the regular recipient of for 5 years and which still did what it always had done. "Better life," he said. "Much better," she agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it, and the candle burned down in the quiet, and outside the plains went on in all directions, enormous and open and full of whatever came next. And inside the house on the main street of Caldwell, 2 people sat with their hands linked across a plain wooden table and were, completely and without reservation, exactly where they were supposed to be.